Daniel Carter knew from the moment he moved into Oak Ridge Estates that the HOA would be a headache, but he hadn't expected a full-scale war. The house had been a good deal: 3 bedrooms, a spacious garage, and just enough backyard for his dog Rusty to roam without issue. It was supposed to be a fresh start, a quiet retirement from years of hard labor as a mechanic, where he could finally enjoy his days without worrying about deadlines, customer complaints, or busted transmissions. But peace was never an option, not with Marlene Whitmore running the neighborhood like a personal fiefdom. She introduced herself on the very first day, clipboard in hand, a frozen smile stretching across her face. "Welcome to Oak Ridge Estates, Mr. Carter," she had said, voice dripping with a type of practiced hospitality that concealed a razor's edge. "I like to ensure all new residents understand the importance of maintaining our community's standards." What followed was a rapid-fire listing of rules. Trash bins must be brought in by 7 a.m. sharp. No vehicles in the driveway unless in active use. Lawn must remain uniformly cut. No patchy mowing. Decorations must be pre-approved. Any modifications to the exterior require a signed HOA form and board approval. Daniel had nodded, humoring her, but even then, he could tell she was sizing him up. He had seen her kind before, the ones who thrived on control, who found purpose in wielding authority over others because they had none anywhere else in life. Still, he didn't expect her to be this relentless. The citation started immediately. The first was a friendly reminder about his trash bin being visible from the street for 8 minutes past regulation. The second was a warning about the color of his mailbox, which apparently wasn't within the earth tone palette mandated by the HOA's aesthetic guidelines. Then came a notice regarding his truck. "This vehicle appears to be non-operational," Marlene had written in perfect, looping script. "HOA regulations prohibit vehicle storage in driveways. Please remove it immediately." Daniel had stared at the notice in disbelief. His truck, a well-maintained Ford F-250, was parked in his own driveway, in perfect working condition. He used it daily, whether for runs to the hardware store or weekend drives with Rusty. This wasn't a rusted-out jalopy rotting on cinder blocks. It was his primary mode of transportation. That was when he realized this wasn't about rules. This was about him. Marlene didn't like that he wasn't bending, wasn't scrambling to please her like the rest of the residents who had been beaten into submission by years of fines and nitpicking. He had seen the way his neighbors avoided eye contact when she walked by, how they gritted their teeth and muttered apologies when she pointed out an infraction on their properties. They feared her. But Daniel, he wasn't built to be ruled. So he did the one thing Marlene couldn't stand. He ignored her. He left the truck where it was. When another notice came, he threw it away. When she escalated to official warnings, he shot back an email, demanding proof that his legally registered, fully operational vehicle was in violation. And when she tried to bring it up in an HOA meeting, he called her bluff in front of the entire board, demanding to see exactly where in the community bylaws it stated that a vehicle couldn't be parked in a private driveway unless it was moving at all times. The board members had exchanged nervous glances. Some of them had wanted to challenge Marlene for years but never had the nerve. Now, with Daniel openly defying her, they were starting to see cracks in her rule. Marlene didn't like that. She stopped sending letters and started getting creative. First, it was the passive-aggressive tactics, sudden inspections of his property, anonymous complaints about noise disturbances that were never real, a warning about his grass being 1/4 inch too tall before he even had a chance to mow it. Then things escalated. One morning, he found nails scattered in his driveway. Not a couple, not just bad luck, a deliberate spread of metal spikes, positioned exactly where his truck's tires would roll. He swept them up without a word, but the message was clear. Marlene was escalating. Daniel could have reported it, could have confronted her outright, but something told him this was just the beginning. If she was willing to sabotage him like this, what else was she capable of? He decided to wait, to watch, to see how far she was willing to go. And sure enough, she went too far. Because the next morning, when Daniel backed out of his driveway, he felt it. A violent jolt. The unmistakable crunch of metal against rubber. His truck lurched, one tire blowing out instantly, the others quickly following. He slammed on the brakes, heart hammering as he stepped out to inspect the damage. That's when he saw them. Metal spike strips, installed directly into his driveway. A wave of cold fury washed over him. This wasn't just petty harassment. This was dangerous. She had sabotaged his property in broad daylight, without fear of consequence, so convinced of her power that she thought she could get away with anything. Daniel didn't yell, didn't storm to her door. Instead, he crouched down and inspected the strips. The installation was deliberate, the screws drilled in cleanly. This had been planned. He pulled out his phone, took pictures, then grabbed his toolbox and carefully pried the spikes from the pavement. He noted the brand, the size, the way they had been installed. Then he did what Marlene never expected. He called a friend, a cop, and he set a trap. Daniel didn't rush. He didn't bang on Marlene's door or scream about the damage to his truck. That's what she expected. That's what she wanted. A dramatic confrontation, a shouting match that would let her twist the narrative in her favor, painting him as the aggressive, unstable new homeowner while she remained composed, rule-abiding HOA leader. But Daniel wasn't playing by her rules. Instead, he calmly gathered his evidence. He took high-resolution photos of the spike strips, noting the exact placement of the screws that had been drilled into his driveway. He checked the tire damage, documenting every puncture mark, every precise cut that aligned perfectly with the strips. Then he examined the surrounding area. The way the edges of the pavement were slightly disturbed. A small pile of dust and debris near the base of the strips, evidence that they hadn't been there for long. They had been installed recently. More importantly, they had been installed by someone with access to his property. And that narrowed down the suspect list to exactly one person. Marlene. Daniel had lived long enough to know that when you deal with someone like her, you don't retaliate emotionally, you retaliate logically. You build a case so airtight that when the time comes, there's no room for doubt. That's when he made the call. Detective Brian Holt had been a friend of Daniel's for years. They weren't drinking buddies or anything, but they had worked together enough. Daniel as a mechanic, Brian as a guy who occasionally needed quick fixes on his unmarked vehicle, to have mutual respect. When Brian answered, his voice was wary. This better not be about whole bullshit. Oh, it is, Daniel said, but this time it's criminal. 20 minutes later, an unmarked black sedan pulled up in front of Daniel's house. Brian stepped out, dressed in his usual low-effort, slightly wrinkled button-down, his badge clipped to his belt. He didn't look like much to outsiders, just another tired cop putting in the hours. But Daniel had seen firsthand how sharp the man's instincts were. Brian crouched beside the spike strips, running his fingers over the drill holes. Jesus, she really did this. Unless the neighborhood's got a rogue driveway saboteur. Yeah, Daniel said dryly. Brian sighed, standing up. I'll be honest, I've dealt with HOA complaints before. Noise disputes, petty vandalism, people calling about a damn fence being an inch too high. But this is next-level psychotic. He shook his head. You got security cameras? Daniel clenched his jaw. No, but I've got the evidence. That's a start, but it's not enough. We can prove what happened, but not who did it. Brian rubbed his chin. We need her in the act. Otherwise, it's just speculation. Daniel exhaled slowly, thinking. He knew Brian was right. A solid case wasn't just about proving a crime. It was about eliminating any plausible deniability. And Marlene? She was all about plausible deniability. If they confronted her now, she'd deny it. Say it must have been vandalism. Blame local teens. Claim she was the real victim of a neighborhood conspiracy against her. No, they needed more. So they set the trap. Daniel went to the hardware store and bought a fresh set of spike strips, the same brand, the same type. When he got home, he carefully reinstalled them in the driveway, making it look like nothing had changed. But this time, they weren't bolted in. They were loosely placed, positioned just enough to look real, but easily removable. Then came the real bait, a dummy security camera. Marlene didn't know much about technology. She was the kind of woman who still printed out emails for her records. So Daniel set up a fake camera, mounting it just above his garage, angled directly at the driveway. It had no wires, no power source, but from a distance, it looked legit. Now, all they had to do was wait. Brian parked a few houses down, watching from his sedan. Daniel went about his usual routine, making sure to leave his truck parked in the driveway just like before. The goal was simple, give Marlene enough rope to hang herself. And sure enough, she took the bait. It was just past midnight when Daniel's phone buzzed. A text from Brian. She's here. Daniel sat up, adrenaline spiking as he crept to his window. Sure enough, There was a shadow moving across his driveway, small, hunched, careful. He couldn't see her face, but he didn't need to. He recognized that posture, that meticulous, deliberate way of moving. Marlene was removing the spike strips. She must have noticed the fake camera and panicked. She thought she was covering her tracks, erasing evidence before he could catch her. But what she didn't know was that Brian was already out of his car, moving in. A flashlight beam cut through the darkness. "Step away from the driveway, ma'am." Marlene froze. Brian's voice was steady, professional, but there was an unmistakable edge to it, the kind that told people he wasn't in the mood for games. Slowly, Marlene turned. The light hit her face, and for the first time since this feud started, Daniel saw fear in her eyes. What is this?" she stammered. I was just... "You were tampering with private property," Brian said, stepping forward. Again, Marlene's hands trembled. "This is a misunderstanding. You installed illegal hazards on someone else's driveway, causing property damage and endangerment. And now you've been caught trying to remove the evidence." Brian pulled out a pair of handcuffs. "That's called destruction of evidence. And you just turned a vandalism case into something a whole lot more serious." Daniel leaned against his doorframe, arms crossed. He didn't say a word. He just watched. Watched as Marlene realized she had lost. Watched as her power crumbled around her. And watched as, for the first time in her life, she had to answer for her actions. Marlene Whitmore had spent years perfecting the art of intimidation. She didn't rule through logic or fairness. She ruled through fear, through a meticulous combination of bureaucracy and passive-aggressive tactics that kept the entire neighborhood under her thumb. The threat of fines, of being written up, of getting dragged into HOA disputes that could last months, that's what gave her power. But none of that mattered now. Not when she was standing in the middle of Daniel Carter's driveway, floodlights illuminating her like a caught burglar, a detective towering over her with a pair of handcuffs glinting in the dim light. "I was just making sure there were no unauthorized installations," she stammered, her voice pitching higher than usual, her perfectly curated authority slipping through her fingers. Brian Holt, who had dealt with real criminals, didn't flinch. Unauthorized installations? On his own driveway. He tilted his head, unimpressed. "Try again." Daniel remained by the doorway, arms crossed, letting her twist in the moment. He had no reason to interrupt. Marlene was doing this to herself. She licked her lips, searching for an angle, a way to claw back control. "I received a complaint," she lied, "from another resident, about potential hazards in the neighborhood. As HOA president, it's my duty to..." Former HOA president, Daniel cut in, his voice level. "You were removed weeks ago." That hit her like a slap. Her mouth opened, then closed. For so long, she had been the undisputed ruler of Oak Ridge Estates. She still thought she had power, even after they had taken her title away. But she didn't. She was just another homeowner now. And worse, she was a criminal. Brian sighed, shaking his head as he pulled out a small notebook. "So let me get this straight," he said, flipping through pages. "You're claiming you came out here in the middle of the night by yourself after receiving a mysterious, unreported complaint, and what? Just so happened to stumble upon these metal spike strips? The same exact ones that shredded this guy's tires, and decided to remove them out of the kindness of your heart." Marlene hesitated. I didn't say that." Brian snapped his notebook shut. "Well, good, because that'd be a really bad lie." The air was thick with tension. She knew she was trapped, but her mind was still searching for a way out. Daniel could see it in her eyes, that desperate, calculating flicker of someone trying to rewrite reality in real time. But there was nothing left for her to rewrite, because Brian wasn't just here for an idle conversation. He pulled a folded document from his pocket and held it up between two fingers. "This," he said, "is a criminal complaint." Marlene's breath caught. Multiple acts of vandalism, harassment, destruction of property, and reckless endangerment. Brian's voice remained eerily calm. "Your spike strips didn't just damage property. They posed an active danger to the residents of this neighborhood. What if a kid on a bike hit them? What if a pedestrian tripped over them at night?" He gave her a measured look. "That's a liability nightmare, not just for you, but for the HOA itself." Marlene's face drained of color. It was one thing to face personal consequences. But the entire HOA? That was a different beast. Because if the association got sued, then it wasn't just her problem. It was the problem of every homeowner in Oak Ridge Estates. And the moment they realized that, they would turn on her in an instant. Her breathing quickened. You can't do this. I was acting in the interest of the community. Brian exhaled through his nose, a hint of amusement flickering across his face. That's funny, he mused. Because I spoke to a few community members today. He tilted his head toward Daniel. Seems like no one actually wanted these rules. They just didn't want to deal with you harassing them if they spoke up. Marlene's lips trembled. For the first time, she had nothing to say. No citation, no policy, no excuse. And Daniel knew why. Because Marlene wasn't just obsessed with control. She was terrified of losing it. She had built her entire identity around being the enforcer, the protector of order. Without that, she was nothing. And she was starting to realize that. Brian let the silence hang for a moment longer before gesturing toward his squad car. You're going to come with me. We'll process this properly at the station. I suggest you think about your next words very carefully. Marlene panicked. I don't have to go anywhere, she snapped, her voice rising, her desperation cracking through. I know my rights. This is harassment. I have authority here. Brian let out a slow, measured breath. No, you had authority. Now you're just someone who got caught. That was it. That was the breaking point. Marlene lunged, not at Brian, but toward Daniel, as if she could somehow undo everything by sheer force of will. You think you're so clever, she spat. You think you've won? Daniel didn't flinch, didn't move. He just let her self-destruct. Brian was on her in an instant. His hand snapped out, grabbing her wrist, smoothly flipping her around in one practiced motion. Click. The handcuffs locked into place. Marlene froze. The entire neighborhood was watching. Lights were flicking on. Curtains were moving. People were stepping onto their porches. The same residents who had lived under her rule for years, terrified of speaking out, were now witnessing her downfall in real time. And no one stopped it. No one defended her. No one ran to her aid. Because no one wanted her in power anymore. Marlene, breath heaving, looked at Daniel. She expected gloating. Expected some smug remark, some I told you so. But Daniel just shook his head. You did this to yourself, he said. And that was the worst part. Not the handcuffs. Not the crowd watching. The realization that he was right. Brian tightened his grip on her arm. Let's go. Marlene, the once untouchable dictator of Oak Ridge Estates, was dragged away in handcuffs. And the neighborhood? For the first time in years, they were free. Marlene Whitmore had never experienced true silence before. Even when she wasn't talking, she had always been heard. Through the neatly typed violations slipped under doors, the HOA meetings where her word was final, the hushed fear in a homeowner's voice when they called her to ask permission for something as simple as an outdoor light fixture. She had built her identity around control, around being the enforcer. But now, sitting in the cold, sterile holding cell of a local police station, for the first time in decades, no one was listening to her. She had screamed, of course. Not in the physical sense. She wasn't foolish enough to thrash against the cuffs or fight against the officer leading her inside. But she had used her voice, her sharpest weapon, to demand a phone call, to insist on speaking with her lawyer, to make it very clear that she was the victim here. The officer processing her had barely looked up from his paperwork. Take a seat, ma'am. That was it. Take a seat. Not Mrs. Whitmore. Not president of the HOA. Just ma'am. And she realized with a sickening lurch in her stomach that she wasn't special here. She was just another person in trouble with the law. And the worst part, she knew exactly how this would play out. The moment word got out, and her name would be all over the community forums, the HOA message boards, the local news. The very power she had once wielded over others would be turned against her in an instant. She wasn't in control of the narrative anymore. Daniel Carter was. Because while Marlene sat in a holding cell, Oak Ridge Estates was waking up. The neighborhood had never felt so alive. Daniel had thought there would be whispers, cautious relief at best. He had underestimated just how deep the resentment ran. By sunrise, the entire neighborhood knew. The most feared woman in Oak Ridge Estates had been arrested on criminal charges. People who had spent years swallowing their frustrations, quietly paying fines to avoid retaliation, were suddenly realizing that they didn't have to be afraid anymore. It started small. A few homeowners began taking down their HOA-approved, neutral-color decorations and replacing them with whatever they actually liked. A couple on Maple Drive finally put out the lawn gnome Marlene had found them over 3 years ago. Someone else dragged out a bright pink flamingo. By noon, several houses had American flags, sports banners, and holiday lights fully displayed, months ahead of schedule, just because they could. The HOA board, now fully aware of the public backlash, called an emergency meeting. And for the first time in Oak Ridge Estates history, it was packed. People who had never attended an HOA meeting in their lives showed up, some still in their pajamas, others clutching folders full of old citations, fines, and complaints that had never been addressed. And they weren't just angry. They were organized. Judith, one of Marlene's longest supporters, stood up first. I think I speak for everyone when I say we need to discuss the future of this HOA. Because what's been happening here? It's not normal. Someone else chimed in. Marlene always made it sound like we didn't have a choice. Like we couldn't fight back. A man near the back, arms crossed, scoffed. Of course she did. She used the HOA as her personal power trip. But let's not pretend we didn't let it happen. How many of us paid those stupid fines just because it was easier than arguing? A quiet murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Daniel leaned against the wall, watching. He had expected relief. He hadn't expected a reckoning. People weren't just venting. They were realizing that the system they had lived under wasn't just unfair. It had been designed to be that way. Marlene had set herself up as an unquestionable authority, but the real problem? They had let her. And now, they were taking it back. The discussions weren't just about removing Marlene. They were about rewriting the rules. By the end of the night, they had a plan. Overhaul the HOA policies, starting with removing arbitrary fines and unnecessary restrictions. Elect a new president, someone with actual community support. Investigate HOA finances, because if Marlene was willing to tamper with private property, who knew what else she had been doing behind the scenes? By the time the meeting ended, something invisible but powerful had shifted in Oak Ridge Estates. For years, this neighborhood had operated on fear. Now, people were done being afraid. Marlene was released later that night. Not because she was innocent. Her lawyer had simply negotiated bail until her hearing. But the moment she stepped outside, she knew something was different. There were no reporters, no supporters, no concerned board members waiting for her. She had expected at least a few allies to still be on her side. Instead, she found silence. Oak Ridge Estates had moved on. It wasn't hers anymore. And as she sat alone in her car, gripping the steering wheel with white-knuckled hands, she realized something that chilled her to the core. For the first time in her life, she had no control over what happened next. Marlene had never known what it was like to be powerless. Not truly. Even before she had become HOA president, she had always been in control. She had been the one people turned to for answers, the one making decisions, the one dictating order wherever she went. She had never been the person sitting on the outside, watching as the world moved forward without her. But now, she was nothing. She had spent years turning Oak Ridge Estates into an extension of herself, a perfectly regulated community where everything was just so, where people were afraid to push back, where every minor rule and bylaw was enforced with an iron grip. And in her mind, she had convinced herself that it was for their own good, that she was necessary, that without her, the neighborhood would collapse into chaos. But now, as she sat alone in her car, parked just outside her house, her own home, which now felt like a foreign, hostile place, she realized something that turned her stomach. The neighborhood was fine. Better, even. The decorations were out. The lights were up. The community was alive in a way she had never seen before. The people who had once cowered under her rule were laughing, talking in their driveways, living. And not one person was looking her way. She wasn't feared. She wasn't respected. She was forgotten. Marlene gritted her teeth and forced herself out of the car, her heels clicking against the pavement. She kept her chin high, her shoulders squared. If they were watching, she wouldn't let them see her break. But they weren't watching. They didn't care. That was worse. She stepped onto her driveway and nearly stumbled. Something was there, something she had never allowed before. A welcome mat. Bright red, bold letters. Live, laugh, love. Her stomach churned. Had someone put this here as a joke? As a final insult? No. The realization hit her all at once. It wasn't a prank. It wasn't some last act of defiance. It was HOA approved. The new board had already begun overturning her rules. The approved neutral color palettes? Gone. The mandatory community aesthetic guidelines? Gone. People were already changing their homes, reclaiming them. And there was nothing she could do about it. Marlene tore the mat away, her breath coming short, her hands trembling. This was her house. She could still control what happened here, at least. But when she turned, she saw something that made her blood run cold. A letter, tucked neatly into her mailbox, the same way she had once delivered violation notices to everyone else. She didn't have to open it to know what it was. Her hand shook as she unfolded the paper. Notice of non-compliance. Driveway repair required. Marlene swayed. She had spent years writing these, years issuing these notices, enforcing every ridiculous rule with absolute authority. And now, she was on the receiving end. The cracks in her driveway, ones she had once ignored, ones she had deemed too minor to concern herself with, had now been deemed a liability, a violation of HOA safety standards. And since she was no longer president, she couldn't just waive it like she had done in the past. She would have to fix it, out of her own pocket. The irony was suffocating. The HOA she had once controlled, the very organization she had built around herself, was now treating her like every other resident, like she was nothing special, like she was just another homeowner who had to follow the rules. For the first time, she understood. It wasn't about control. It had never been about control. It was about power, and she had lost it. Not in some grand, dramatic way, not in a fiery confrontation, but in the smallest, quietest way possible. She had been reduced to a name on a notice, and no one cared. Her hands clenched around the paper. Because the truth was she could leave. She could sell the house, move to another neighborhood, start over. But it wouldn't matter. Because her name was out there now. People had seen her true nature. They had seen her fall. And no one would ever let her hold that kind of power again. She had made sure of that. Marlene Whitmore had always assumed that if she ever left Oak Ridge Estates, it would be on her terms. She had envisioned a farewell where she was respected, where her legacy was preserved, with a neighborhood she had saved would beg her to stay as she gracefully handed the reins to some carefully chosen successor. But now she was trapped in the very system she had spent years building. For weeks, she avoided her neighbors. She stayed indoors, kept her curtains drawn, and refused to acknowledge the quiet revolution happening just beyond her front door. But the world didn't stop moving just because she refused to look at it. The HOA continued without her. The board she once ruled over had moved on, holding meetings without her, rewriting policies that she had spent years enforcing. Her name was erased from documents, her leadership barely a footnote in the minutes. When she tried to call the new president, Rachel Coleman, she was sent to voicemail. When she emailed the HOA about her non-compliance notice, she received a generic response, the same copy-paste format she had once sent to others. She was just another homeowner now, a nobody. At first, she told herself she could wait it out, that people's memories were short, that soon they would realize they still needed her, that without her leadership, things would fall apart. But they didn't. In fact, they flourished. With her gone, people were happier. Homes looked brighter, more unique. The resentment she had carefully cultivated among the residents, pitting them against each other through fines, complaints, and bureaucracy, had vanished. Neighbors were talking again, hosting block parties, decorating without fear. They weren't waiting for her to come back. They were celebrating that she was gone. Marlene had always imagined herself as the glue that held the community together. But in reality, she had been the weight dragging it down. And now, she was irrelevant. It started to eat away at her. She told herself she didn't care about the gossip, about the way people spoke in hushed voices when she passed by. She told herself it didn't matter that former allies like Judith no longer answered her calls. But then came the final blow. One afternoon, as she stepped outside to retrieve her mail, forcing herself to look normal, to act as though she was still in control, she noticed something. Her HOA violation notice was still there. unresolved. She had ignored it, hoping it would simply go away, but that was a luxury she had never afforded others. And the new HOA board, they weren't giving her special treatment. Attached to the letter was a final warning. She had 30 days to make the required driveway repairs, or else she'd be fined. And if she ignored that, the HOA had the legal authority to place a lien on her home. The same tactic she had used for years to force people into compliance, now being used against her. She clenched her fists. She could fight it. She could try to sue the HOA, claim wrongful enforcement, drag them into a legal battle. But the truth was she had no case. She had spent years crafting an HOA so airtight, so ruthlessly efficient, that it left no room for exceptions. And now she was stuck in it. She had created the very machine that was now destroying her. Marlene stood there, frozen on her front steps, staring at the letter, her heart pounding in her ears. Because for the first time in her life, she had to ask herself a question she had never considered before. What happens when the enforcer has nowhere left to run? She was no longer the one giving orders. She was the one following them. And no one was coming to save her. The people she had ruled over, the ones she had fined and threatened, the ones she had silenced with legal jargon and intimidation, they were free. And she was just another name on an HOA list. Subject to the rules. Subject to the consequences. Subject to the system she had built. And for the first time in her life, Marlene Whitmore finally understood what it felt like to lose.